Dr. Eleanor Breen is a historical archaeologist with over 2 decades of experience on sites in the Mid-Atlantic region. As city archaeologist, Eleanor currently directs the unique community archaeology program that preserves and interprets Alexandria's history. She holds degrees in anthropology from the College of William and Mary, the University of Massachusetts, Boston, University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Eleanor currently serves as the president of the Council of Virginia Archaeologists. She and her family live in a historic neighborhood of Alexandria. And before we get into the presentation, I also want to mention Don Chaumet's book about Maritime Alexandria that he did. It's probably in the background there. My copy is in the other office, but
yeah, it's one of these.
I suspect that's become somewhat of a Bible for you all there, yeah. And as Don documents things so in such a wonderful, granular manner. But anyway, we're very pleased to have Eleanor with us tonight. Dr. Breen, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good evening. It's nice to see you. We have a nice small group, so happy to answer any questions as we go along if you have them and they arise, so you don't forget them by the end of the presentation. So let me share my screen here. And 1 minute. Okay, hopefully that shows up by a PowerPoint slide on your screens right now.
That's very good.
Very good. Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you, Brendan and Maritime chapter of the ASV. I'm very excited to be here this evening to talk about Alexandria's maritime heritage and to give you an update on some of the archaeology projects that have been going on the waterfront for the past few years. Just to give you a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with Alexandria or our archaeology program, we are part of a division of the Office of Historic Alexandria. We are a museum system with 13 museums and historic sites throughout the city that highlight many different aspects of Alexandria's history, from firefighting to taverns to the Civil War and African American history. And some of our newest sites that have come to be part of our museum system include Freedom House, that's 1315 Duke Street, the Franklin and Armfield slave pen. Alexandria was a central point in the domestic slave trade in the 1820s and 30s and up to the Civil War. And so that's a piece of Alexandria's history that we're currently working to interpret and reckon with. As archaeologists for the city, our main role is to implement the Archaeological Protection Code, to also curate the 3 million artifacts we have from nearly 250 archaeological sites that have been registered in the city's nearly 16 square miles, and also to partner with the community to save and share our past, particularly through our Archaeology Museum, which is on the 3rd floor of the Torpedo Factory. We are currently open Thursdays through Sundays. If you find yourself in Old Town, come on up to the 3rd floor of the Torpedo Factory Art Center and say hi. All the work we do is supported by our Alexandria Archaeological Commission. This is a group of residents appointed by City Council to advocate and advise on issues of archaeology and preservation to the City Council members. This is the oldest archaeological commission of its kind, formed in 1975. They've been around since then. And then we're also supported by our friends group, the Friends of Alexandria Archaeology, which is also a storied and long-term institution of the city. Before 1989, there were no legal requirements for archaeology prior to development. And so all the development-related archaeology that occurred in the city, and some did on sites of high significance, was negotiated in the spirit of goodwill between the archaeologists and the developers. But since 1989, we have been part of the development review process in the city, and the sites I'm going to talk about tonight are all generated from these archaeology protection code related projects. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. As a bit of background, in 2012, the Alexandria City Council approved a plan to revitalize Alexandria's historic waterfront. So just as people did back in the 18th century, wanting to transform their sleepy tobacco port into a prosperous seaport town, the city envisioned a vibrant waterside destination and wanted to see some changes made along the waterfront. And so because of our unique 30-year-old archaeological protection code that requires excavation prior to certain developments, we really geared up for a period of an intense focus on some of the most significant sites within the nation's third oldest historic district. Block by block, project by project, the remains of wharves and warehouses, dwellings, industries, privies, and 4 ships, hopefully you can see those stars on the screen there, have emerged from the waterlogged depths at the river's edge. Even as individual features and artifact assemblages, these are really highly significant finds, but when they're taken together with a wealth of documentary information, we're only just beginning to tap into this maritime cultural landscape. The majority of the archaeology that I'll talk about today is, if you can see my cursor, can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yep.
So the majority of the work is on this block and the one over here that straddle Duke Street. So that's the foot of Duke Street, and I'm going to move my screen around a little bit here. Okay, so this is the site of Robinson Landing. It's a new mixed-use residential property today. So these are all buildings today, but they were warehouses up until about 2018. And then this is the new site of the Hotel Indigo. That's the location of the first ship found archaeologically. The research and analysis and the public products that will come out of this work are still ongoing. So I'm going to give you updates, but not a lot of conclusions yet today. In thinking about Alexandria's seaport history, we turn our focus to what Ben Ford has suggested when theorizing underwater archaeology, this idea of a maritime cultural landscape. And so what I really mean here is we're talking about a culture and a time when people's lives were closely attuned to the sea. And as anthropologists, we're interested in how those interactions between culture and landscape, between the seas and the rivers, manifest themselves in material culture and in other forms of culture. And so for a long time, Alexandria was a town whose identity was really rooted in its relationship to the river. It was primarily an eastward facing town, which is really hard to picture today in Alexandria, where really our only connection to the river, one of our only connections, is through the water taxi that used to take lots more Nats fans up to Nats Stadium before they got rid of Max Scherzer and became the last place team in the National League. So a little quieter down there recently. But one of the archaeologists who's written about maritime cultural landscapes said that if you have a population who that isn't engaged with maritime preoccupations, whose lives aren't attuned to the sea, then you really don't have a maritime culture. And I would say that that's certainly how we are today in Alexandria. But just years ago, Alexandria's relationship was to the sea was preeminent. And so in contrast to the water taxi, this just gives you a very brief glimpse of how Alexandria was connected to the wider Atlantic world in a brief period from 1784 to 1790. And this is building off some of the research that Don Chalmette did, pulling together the comings and goings of ships. And what we learned from this research is really that our primary connection is along the mid-Atlantic seaboard, particularly up Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston, but of course across the Atlantic to Europe as well, London, and then down to the Caribbean. And our connection to places like Barbados was stronger before the time of the Revolutionary War, but starts to shift after the Revolution. The ships that crossed the Atlantic and came up and down the western side here are carrying human beings by force or by choice, finished goods and raw products from across the Atlantic world. So let's take a minute to give a little background on some of the archaeology that's occurred here in Alexandria over the past few years. This is a map of Alexandria, drawn by George Washington in 1748 before the town is founded. You can see this is the much written about in historic documents original crescent-shaped bay of Alexandria. At the topmost point was known as West Point, and that's where original settlement occurred in Alexandria, and the southernmost point was known as Point Lumley. The black line is the modern shoreline today, and you can see the gray streets have been overlain on top of George Washington's map. And what becomes immediately evident is that Alexandrians embarked on a massive campaign to fill in that crescent-shaped bay to reach the deeper channel of the Potomac River and become a more viable port. And so when we saw the archaeological work, or the development work rather, being proposed there on the north and south sides of Duke Street, when we overlaid those projects on top of Washington's map and others that we have, we knew that some potentially pretty remarkable finds would come together. Between about 1785 and 1791, and Don Jomut writes extensively about this, there's a massive, well-orchestrated and largely undocumented campaign to fill in that crescent-shaped bay and essentially create 10 city blocks that didn't previously exist. Enslaved and indentured labor was undoubtedly employed as part of this land building effort, which was undertaken primarily on the part of private landowners who got to keep and have access to the property that they built to the east. We know, for example, in 1785 in the Alexandria Gazette, there's a report, quote, "Last week, as a Negro man was digging under the bank, unfortunately, a large mass of earth fell upon him and fractured his thigh." So what they're describing there, of course, is the men who participated in the process, but also the topographic feature of a pretty steep bank there going down to the shallow mudflats of the Potomac River, cutting into those banks and dragging the earth into the bay there. And let me just check, I think, okay, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't a question in the chat. Okay, and so this is a photograph. This is taken facing south, of course, that's the Potomac River on the left-hand side. The Woodrow Wilson Bridge is in the background. And one of our intrepid local historians has gained his way all the way up into the newly built Hotel Indigo and taken a photo of the archaeology as it's occurring at the development site of Robinson Landing. And you're starting to see, even in their initial trenches, there's archaeological features appearing. There's foundations of an 18th century warehouse that have already started to emerge, and they end up excavating the entire city block. The recent archaeological work that's occurred on the water is best known for the discovery and excavation of 4 derelict ship hull fragments, which supported these land-making efforts, essentially trapping in that redeposited earth that's being pulled down from the banks and preventing erosion. So these ship hull fragments are not shipwrecks. They haven't met some catastrophic end in a storm, but in fact are purposefully shaped and cut and used as pieces of vernacular architecture. These ships have passed their seafaring life and have then been reused as readily available pieces of architecture from which to build the foundations of early Alexandria. And you can see that really well in this picture right here. This is the second ship discovered at the Robinson Landing site. And you can see it's literally built underneath of a 18th century warehouse, wharf and warehouse on top of it. And over here, this is another ship from the site. You can see something very similar. This is the remains of a wharf, again, built on top of this smaller ship that was excavated from this site. Then Ford, underwater archaeologist, did a lot of study of these ships as pieces of vernacular architecture. It isn't unique to Alexandria to have these ships used as pieces of land making. And in fact, he goes through and documents the other cases throughout the world where this happens. So moving on to the excavation of the first ship that was discovered in Alexandria in 2015. So this happened at the site of the Hotel Indigo. You can see they're down deep in the ground here. They're probably about 20 feet below the surface of the ground. Again, there's the Potomac River in the background, and they've come upon the timbers of this historic ship. When it was found in the ground, it measured about 12.5 feet by 50 foot, a fragment of the hull of a wooden cargo vessel, likely a merchant ship. The bow and the starboard were present. The stern and the port side are missing. The layers of construction were fairly intact, including the keel, the bow stem, sacrificial planking, hull planking frames with minimal ceiling planking left. So I don't probably have to explain to you all how the keel basically acts as the spine of a ship, and the ribs are the hull planking. And then you can see the little white tags indicate where they have gone through and systematically labeled each timber, drawn a map. We did 3D laser scanning in the field, and then they have the backhoe out there assisting with the dismantling process, taking the ship apart piece by piece. Dendrochronology was subsequently performed on the timbers, and the ship appears to date sometime after 1741. At least that's when the timbers were felled, likely from wood grown outside the Boston region in Massachusetts. Based on map review, it appears that this block is filled in sometime before 1798. So at least we know that the ship was likely in the ground in the 18th century. And so this is definitely a Revolutionary War era ship. After the pieces of the ship were taken apart, you can see them being loaded up onto this trailer right here in the background. They were taken to a warehouse where they were stored in tanks of water to prevent disintegration. And the wood is preserved in the ground because it was a truly anaerobic environment, no oxygen, and waterlogged environment for over 200 years. As soon as those timbers hit the air, the work had to go very quickly to make sure that we didn't lose any of the wood, that none of it disintegrated as we were documenting and transporting it to the water in the warehouse. In 2017, the city contracted with Texas A&M University to conserve the ship timbers. So we kept them safe in these tanks of water for about 1.5 years. And then we packaged them all up like Christmas presents and loaded them onto a tractor trailer. They were driven to Texas A&M University's Conservation Research Lab, where they were unpacked, 3D laser scanned, and began the conservation process. We had an extraordinary amount of help from people in this whole, over the course of this whole endeavor, and I have a slide to thank all of them at the end here. We certainly appreciated an enormous amount of help from Naval History and Heritage Command, Alexandria Seaport Foundation, members of City Council, and also our Archaeological Commission and many others who aided in this process. We've also had constant advice and guidance from the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab on how to deal with fragile resources like waterlogged wood. Currently, the exciting conservation process is ongoing in Texas, and we were actually able to go and see that work. That trip was funded by a National Maritime Heritage Grant through the National Park Service. We actually got to travel to Texas and see the beginning stages of conservation, which begins with chelation and the removal of iron concretions that, if not treated and removed, will continue to damage the wood over time once it's finally conserved and brought out into the air. So we learned a lot about that process on our trip, and here you can see the incredibly large frames and futtocks sitting in this bath of ammonium citrate undergoing chelation. We also got a tour of what I think is the world's largest, definitely the country's largest, maybe the world's largest freeze dryer. So after the timbers go through chelation, they will go into a process of saturation in polyethylene glycol, which will replace the water in the cellular structure of the wood with this waxy substance. And then they will all be put into a freeze dryer for about 6 months to remove any remaining water from the wood and allow them to come out and be reconstructed and put on exhibit. And so the other thing we did when we were in Texas was we took a tour of LaBelle shipwreck that's on exhibit in the Texas State Historical Museum. And we learned about how that process came to be, how the conservation process worked, how they were able to build this steel frame in which to reconstruct and exhibit that centerpiece of the museum. So that was a good experience. And so the goal of this project has always been sort of inspired by LaBelle, inspired by the French bateau that's on exhibit in the Museum of Civilization in Quebec, the Viking Museum, to give visitors a sense of this maritime history and culture that was present in Alexandria, and sort of how ships can embody a tangible piece of our past. In the meantime, as all the conservation work is going on, the archaeologists at the Conservation Research Lab were able to take the individual 3D laser scans of the timbers, put that back together on the computer to basically create a reconstructed ship from the individual laser scan files, and then to take the remnant that was found archaeologically and start to conjecture out what the original shape of the hull might have looked like from the surviving evidence. And so the product of that, in addition to the digital model, is a 1:12 scale model that combines the modern art of 3D laser printing and piecing the together and set that within a wire frame that what the hull could have possibly looked like. We think the researchers think that the ship may have been about 71 feet. So you can see, you know, the parts that were missing when it was reused in the ground as landfill. And I think that this is one of my favorite outcomes of this project, because it really represents what we do archaeologically, right, which is take a small fragment of something and layer on additional evidence to come up with our interpretation of the past. And that's what they did here with this model. We've had some conversations about what the rigging of this vessel or what the upper works might have looked like. It's really difficult to say because the keelson and the mast steps were not present. They were scavenged and removed before the ship was scuttled to make land. However, the reconstructed dimensions of the hull suggest to the researchers that there may have been appropriate for a large sloop or a small-sized brig, and so those examples are here. Okay, so after that ship was found and we made a determination to move forward with conservation, in 2018, Thunderbird, who completed the archaeological work for this first site, the Hotel Indigo site, was also contracted to do the archaeological work at the Robinson Landing site, which is that big block-wide archaeological project to the south. And they were at this point experts in finding archaeological ships. And so they sort of knew what to prepare for when the excavations began at Robinson Landing. And beginning in early 2018, they found 3 more ship hull fragments at this site. So you can see one here, and one here down at the bottom, right by Wolf Street. And I think what this map hopefully gives you a good idea of is the shoreline as George Washington maps it in 1748, the map that's drawn in 1798 showing the build out of the land, and then by 1845 just how much land had been built out along Alexandria shore. So these 2 ships seem closest to the original landform. This one is a little further out, and this one is further out still. You also get a little bit of a sense of the relative sizes of the ships. So when these were discovered, we undertook the same process of documentation, hand drawing in the field. This time Thunderbird performed photogrammetry, so they took hundreds of pictures to be stitched together in a software program called Agisoft to create a computer model of how the ship was discovered in situ. And then again, we worked with the archaeologists at Thunderbird, the developer, and others to carefully take the pieces of the ship apart, put them on a trailer, and transport them to a warehouse where they sit currently in 9 tanks of water. or 9 pop-up pools, backyard pop-up pools, actually. And I'll show you a video of that in just a second. A program of 3D digital documentation has also been implemented for these timbers. So we've worked with Texas A&M University to 3D laser scan the individual timbers themselves so that they can again go through the process of creating a computer model and a 1:12 scale model. The ships, particularly this ship found along Wolf Street, which is completely huge. Over 80 feet of it was recovered in length archaeologically, really captured the attention of Alexandrians and frankly of people across the country. We may never know the names of these 4 merchant vessels, but they're certainly an evocative piece of our maritime heritage that we're currently bringing to light. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the excavation of this ship. It had a remarkable degree of preservation. You can see all the ceiling planking that existed when it was excavated. The keelson was present. And because this ship actually straddled inside the development and under Wolf Street, we were only able to recover what would have been impacted by the construction project. It was about 30 feet deep below the surface of the ground at the deepest point. So it was sort of steep and a dangerous effort to get the timbers out. And so the developer put a concrete, a bentonite slurry wall. It actually runs through the length of the ship, preserving what's left in the ground on one side, and we removed all of the timbers from the other side. And you can see there's the backhoe operator, and we're mainly using the power of this modern day equipment to help pull these timbers that are mainly just fastened by trunnels or wooden tree nails. The force required to really dismantle the ship was couldn't be done with just strong people. It needed some mechanical assistance, so that's what's happening there. Okay, so just to give a brief sort of where are we now. With the 3 ships that are not currently undergoing conservation, they're being kept wet in storage at a building we call the bus barn. It's an old city warehouse. We've completed the documentation and laser scanning, and the Conservation Research Lab at Texas A&M is currently working on the models. The next phase is to embark on storage of these timbers and selective conservation. So right now they're in temporary storage. We're moving to a longer situation. Just to give you a sense of the laser scanning process, here Texas A&M researchers are using a Faro laser scanner to move the laser all around the timber to take the images on all sides, and then they have to stitch those individual sides back together to create a single file for each timber. And this gives you a little bit of a sense of the warehouse with the pop-up pools filled with archaeological ships. And then from left to right, this gives you a sense of where they've gotten with their computer models. The furthest ship on the left is the one that was found first under the hotel site, and the rest are from the site just south. And you can see just how massive this ship was in comparison to the other 3. The other 3 all were generally about 50 feet long, at least as they were preserved in the ground. I'll show those show those YouTube videos in just a second. Let me move forward to this next phase of the project, which is a longer-term storage situation for these 1,000 timbers from 3 ships that were excavated from the shoreline. Our office, Historic Alexandria, worked with other offices in the city on a process of figuring out what's the next best step for these timbers, from everything from submerging them into the bottom of a pond, reburying them in some kind of underground storage, continuing to store them in tanks, or moving towards full conservation. And we also worked closely with our Archaeological Commission to work through some of these options. And we landed on storage, a program of storage and selective conservation, where we've identified a city pond called Ben Brenman Pond, which will serve as a medium-term storage option, preserving the possibility for future study or conservation once funding and a vision sort of come together. And this pond is particularly easy to access, to get in and out of. The potential artifacts can be mitigated, and we'll be embarking on a program of monitoring the timbers over the years to make sure that they're surviving well in this pond storage. There's a low likelihood of the timbers to affect the water quality. It's lower longer-term cost and staff resources to store them in a pond. It's definitely less city resource intensive, and we've done a lot of work with the MAC lab to kind of talk through this innovative storage solution. Putting historic timbers in a pond. And the SHA, the Society for Historical Archaeology, produced a technical brief where they talked about reburial or submerging timbers as being a good potential for long-term preservation of waterlogged wood. They write that the scale and significant conservation problems of archaeological wood from shipwreck sites make the issue of paramount concern for the field of maritime archaeology. And so we've worked closely with Nicole Daub from the MAC Lab, who actually took on a project just like this with the Nanticoke shipwreck, which was excavated in the Nanticoke River. Brady laser scanned the timbers and eventually submerged at the bottom of a pond at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. Here they are, the archaeologists are handing the individually wrapped timbers, the timbers that are wrapped in geotextile, to scuba divers for then placement on the bottom of the pond, where they will be mapped and registered as an archaeological site. So Ben Brenman Pond is a stormwater pond that's in the heart of one of the busiest and most popular parks in Alexandria. It's located just off Duke Street. You can see surrounded by ball fields and a great place to go and walk around in the city. And so we'll be putting up interpretive signage to talk about the process, to talk about why there are ship timbers at the bottom of this pond as part of an outreach effort as well. Okay, so we are looking towards the fall to undertake this timber relocation project. As I mentioned, there'll be interpretive signage. We will implement a monitoring schedule at the recommendation of the MAC Lab conservator, which we will actually pull some timbers up on an interval basis to examine the condition of the wood and make sure that everything is going according to plan, which means nothing's changing, nothing's happening, and we'll reassess this solution in 20 years. Okay, so just in the big picture, to wrap it up, what's next for these fantastic finds, and our goal to tell the stories of early seaport Alexandria through the archaeological remains and documentary sources. And that's where I'll bring us back at 2012 waterfront small area plan that really set the course for future changes along the waterfront. And one of those changes, even before all these waterfront discoveries, was to have some kind of history center potentially located in the waterfront area to talk about Alexandria's history and to orient people to their visit. And over the course of the next year, we'll be undertaking a museum feasibility study, going through lots of different steps to determine if there is an interest and support for a new museum along Alexandria's waterfront, a place to highlight some of these incredible archaeological finds, but also introduce visitors to our many other historic sites throughout the city. That will all be undertaken with a lot of community input. There are so many stories to tell. I've talked a lot about ships tonight. We also have the remains of a mid-18th century warehouse built by John Carlyle, located at the same site that the first ship was recovered from. Those timbers are undergoing conservation at the Mac Lab, and certainly have a story to tell. This was one of Alexandria's first public works projects. City Council directed John Carlyle to build this warehouse. So that's a great story to tell. And then the other story I want to leave everybody with, this is a recent find that I find particularly relevant to your group with ASV. One of the first finds at the Robinson Landing site were these stone foundations of Robert Howe's 1782 warehouse. So Robert Howe was a successful merchant. He at one point is a mayor of Alexandria. He imports goods from all over the world and stores and sells them from this warehouse here. It actually sits under a building this building may be 100 years old. It sits on top of the original foundations that were found archaeologically. And I think we also have the opportunity to kind of expand our storyline and bring in some of the contributions also of Black Alexandrians to the Alexandria seaport. And so we have a historian working with us who recently discovered a document that's on the bottom left-hand side. This is an indenture of apprenticeship from August 1800 between Robert Townsend Howe and John Hughes. John Hughes was a shipbuilder and sea captain in the late 18th century. And this relates to a young Black boy named Charles. So I just wanted to read a few pieces of this agreement here. The agreement is that a Negro boy belonging to Howe be taught and instructed by Mr. Hughes in the art, mystery, and business of a ship carpenter, and no other business for a period of 12 years. Hughes agrees to teach Charles to the best of his abilities during the 12 years, such that Charles be clothed, fed, and lodged in a comfortable manner that is humane and suitable for such an apprenticeship, and then he be found a physician and a physic during the whole time of his apprenticeship, whenever may be necessary, and all these things will be done at the expense of John Hughes. So this is to teach Charles the business of being a ship carpenter, constructing ships. After the 12 years, Hughes will discharge him, quote, well clothed with hat, handkerchief, coat, jacket, and breeches, a pair of stockings, shoes, buckles, 3 shirts of new, decent, strong things. Also, he's to be provided a broadaxe, an adze, a set of caulking irons, and a toolbox. And Hughes will emancipate Charles, who will receive full and free discharge to enter upon and go into the business for himself. So the goal of a future exhibition could be to pair the archaeological artifacts alongside some of these incredible stories of the people who made Alexandria's waterfront what it was in history and what it is today, an opportunity to tell the rich and difficult history of Alexandria, the story of free and enslaved people who did all this work along the river's edge. And just in closing, we are already starting to see changes in the waterfront and see those changes infused with history. We've recently developed a story map, an African American Heritage Trail walk. You can have it on your phone. You can go on a tour of the waterfront and learn about some of the contributions of African Americans to Alexandria's waterfront. Also, we see some of the new public art infused with history as well. We boast one of the few hotels in the country where the first graphic that you see when you enter the hotel lobby is actually an archaeological drawing of a ship, the ship discovered beneath the hotel. And we've also started to see the buildings come together with pulling from names, street names that were there in the 18th century, the Strand being one of them. And this is the building that was built on top of Howe's warehouse in 1782. And I'll just leave you with a few ways to get in touch with us. And I can go back to that slide. And then I tried, but I'm not sure I did list all the people that have contributed to this project. In particular, the developers, EYA and Car City Centers, who were such a large part of the excavation of both of these sites. So. that's what I have. If you want, I can show you. Let me just show you. Because I feel like I would rather give this tour actually out, this discussion actually out at the warehouse where the ship timbers are located. I thought I'd bring the warehouse to you because it's hard to get a sense of the scale of what I'm talking about here. Let me share my screen and just, if I could, just show you this YouTube video. So can you see the YouTube screen here?
Yes.
Okay, so Thunderbird graciously came out, took time out of their busy day, brought their new drone out to this city warehouse so that we could film what it looked like, full of ship timbers. So you can see on the right-hand side, we have the pop-up pools that you can just buy off Amazon. And then we also had some of the timbers stored in these like roll-off tanks, but we've since gotten rid of these and replaced these with historical documents like that. So photographs. Oh, I think that's actually playing from another video. Anyway, I just want you to see the timbers here as the drone flies over. There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, and there we are actually in the water, moving the timbers around and our waders. That is the bow stem of one of the ships. You can see some of the frames in that tank as well. And we share this space, obviously, with storage of other city equipment. And here we're flying over the frames from the largest ship that's been excavated so far. You can still see the white Tyvek tags that indicate where the timbers came from and which direction they were oriented. And those are associated with a hand-drawn map as well. And that's it.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was very enjoyable. I can't wait to get up that way and see the warehouse. And I know that I think if you send the Dick Steffi Ship Lab as much as a toothpick, they can probably reconstruct the hull for you. They've done some pretty amazing things.
Oh, great.
With some little bits of wood. So
oh, very cool.
It's nice to see that. I'm always impressed at what they're doing. And let's see, one of our former field school students, Jim Wright, I believe, spent some time with you all.
Yes, he did. He spent a lot of time with us.
The Pharaoh, manipulating the Pharaoh arm. I know a number of years ago, when I was with IMH one spring before Roper went south, we went to try to look for an area that was thought to be potentially where Ho was careening his vessels down below, well below Alexandria, just upriver from where the Harry Nice, the 301 bridge is now, kind of around that point. We unfortunately ended up getting a lot of spiking in the mag data from what we thought was laminite formation in the river. So a really ferrous formation that it just screwed up the mag data. So we couldn't tell if there had been very much activity there. But I know that he had a huge empire.
He did,
and it really did impact the river there. So.
Yeah.
Any questions? Lily did join us.
Hi.
Mind me, just hanging out in the background.
We'll end up posting this video so that our fellow membership can see it. I know we've got a couple of folks that are on vacation out of town, but they'll enjoy seeing the presentation here. I know that the research project has been going on for a number of years now and really kind of just building up more and more momentum. And it's nice to be able to see where you can do more with some part of the site and then be more efficient with another part of the site, because that's such a huge conservation and stewardship burden to take on for the city. And I know there's probably been robust discussion about that, but certainly the in-water storage is a wonderful option to have, and that's great. That facility is right there in your backyard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I think what often people don't realize is that conservation kind of never ends. Once an artifact is conserved, whether it's metal, much less waterlogged wood, it requires constant attention. And I think that, that is sometimes manageable when it's a smaller scale, a smaller collection, but it gets to be hard with larger collections. And I also think the science is changing and advancing on that. I mean, certainly we've seen that with the way different shipwrecks have been conserved over time, and the effort to move towards freeze drying after extended periods of impregnation with pegs. So, there's more to do and more to be learned, I think, and perhaps applied in this situation in the future.
Well, Alexandria is going to join the pantheon of international communities that have a conserved shipwreck of that magnitude. Right. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
Although up there with Stockholm and I know, in terms of just the conservation, that's a huge thing to get over, and then you get into the burden of stewardship through interpretation, and it's not over then, because I mean, just imagine what the dusting job is for Mary Rose, because of all of the, you're inviting people in when you want people to see that and interact with these wrecks, but it does, get them dirty again, and you've got a stewardship burden there. So we thoroughly applaud Alexandria for being able to take this project on and in a very multi-scalar way and share this with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much.